this is a ritual. This is a 4-month-long ritual that I'm going to do with myself. You know, I'm not talking to my family, not talking to my girlfriend, not talking to anybody. Well, obviously it was a strange journey. I think any journey where you go into the wilderness and do weird things is always going to start out strange. This idea just kind of came into my mind. I had sort of had a desire or a hunger, or even, I guess I felt it as like a calling, you know, like I really wanted to go deep into the Merlin story. So by the time 2015 came around, I had, you know, really had a fully formed idea of what I wanted to do. You know, I was thinking about the historical aspect of Merlin and kind of like retracing his footsteps in the real places where he was said to have been. And so that's kind of the core of the idea, you know, getting into the root of it through the land. Because of course, you know, the story is quite old, and how can you really touch something that's, you know, from basically the early medieval period? There's nothing really left tangibly, you know, outside of maybe rocks and some very, very few buildings. So that was the idea, you know, touch the spirit through the land. I guess I started by reading everything that I could. There are like quite a few really good books, historically based books, because there is like so many sides, right? There's the historical, there's the literary, there's the esoteric, and some of those overlap a lot, and some of them don't necessarily seem to overlap too much at all. I mean, this was really a big moment for me. It wasn't just like, oh, I'm going to go on vacation for a few months and I'm just going to like get someone to sublet my apartment. I was like, I'm going to sell everything that I don't need. I'm going to put all the essential stuff in my mom's house, which is on the other side of America. I'm going to get everything I need in a backpack. I'm going to quit my job and I'm going to go. And I don't know what's going to happen. I mean, I knew that there would be an end to it. And I mean, I had a map. I didn't know, would I stay? Would something happen to me? Would I, you know, live in a cave for the rest of my life? And I was open to all possibilities at that moment. But, you know, I looked like a backpacker. I had a backpack. I had all my stuff in there. I had scanned all the books that I thought I was going to need because I brought my iPhone with me so that I could, like, document everything. I wanted to be light. And my starting rule was I was going to do the whole thing on foot, because if you want to really get into the spirit of someone from the medieval period, you have to do it on foot. And about a week into it, I realized that it was just going to waste a lot of time. I mean, it was definitely getting me into the mood, but I kind of realized after about a week of walking, like, oh, I don't really need to walk every moment. It's more important to be in the locality. So I did take some buses. I hitchhiked quite a bit, which was awesome. I did walk a lot, but, you know, I didn't walk all the way through Wales or anything like that. I just skipped around and walked for the parts that seemed like it was appropriate. But I did camp out every single night, other than a few nights where it rained, and I would get like a couch surfing host, or occasionally like a B&B just to air out my sleeping bag and stuff. I think maybe 5 nights out of 3 or 4 months I stayed inside, and then the rest was outside. Yeah, for all intents and purposes, it really worked. I mean, the quest worked. I saw everything, and I documented everything that I wanted to document on a physical level. On a more spiritual level, I definitely felt like I had a few peak moments where I went into a lot of other spaces. And I've thought a lot about this since, because after the quest ended, my life completely took a different direction. And let's say that was like the end of one chapter and the beginning of another chapter. And this new chapter that I'm in isn't very, let's say, spiritually oriented. You know, I'm not in the same kind of routines with meditation and energy work that I was in at that time. The question I think a lot about is like, what does it mean to do magic? Because that was kind of part of the question, right? Because Merlin's associated with magic and with this relationship with earth and nature and the spirit world. And so you have to ask yourself, what does it mean to do magic? And now that I don't feel like I'm so immersed in a world of magic, and my worldview is a lot more mundane as opposed to magical now, that I feel like when you intentionally put yourself in a situation like that and you intend for magical things to happen, there's almost no chance that they won't, you know, like not that you're going to make them happen, but you are cultivating the appropriate conditions for them to happen. And like so many weird things happened during the trip that I don't know. They were perfect, you know, and they were exactly what I set out to do. I didn't have to force it. I didn't have to feel like I was faking it in any way. Maybe if you do a ritual or you're trying to do a meditation and get into the zone and you're trying and not really succeeding sometimes because you're thinking about something else or whatever, it wasn't like that. I told everyone I'm off social media, I'm off text, I'm off phone calls. The phone stays off only in camera mode. I wasn't getting text updates or anything. I was like, this is a ritual. This is a 4-month-long ritual that I'm going to do with myself. I'm not talking to my family, not talking to my girlfriend, not talking to anybody. And I pretty much did stick to that. I did kind of put some social media updates as I went, but I wasn't like trying to email and text people. I was really trying to stay present with the land, because otherwise, what's the point? You go through all that work, you do all the research, and you go out there, and then you're just like taking selfies and stuff, and it takes you out of the magical thinking, if you will. You're suddenly back into mundane world where like people are talking about work, and I was just like completely in medieval England. I was in a completely different reality for a few months, even though I was still talking to people, like local people, but my mind went to a different place, and it was really a satisfying experience to have success in that way. What really resonates with me still, and where I would continue to go back, or I do continue to go back, is the Scotland locations. Those ones, I love the Welsh ones, and those ones definitely have the most, I guess, historical connection, because the oldest Merlin stories are Welsh, at least Welsh language. But when you actually do the research, to me, and I know there's a million interpretations of this research, but like when you actually go through the research and what the scholars have said, and in the 1900s, to me it all points to Scotland, and it doesn't point to Cornwall, and it doesn't really point to Wales as much, and it doesn't really point to England at all. I mean, not talking about Arthur at all, just talking about Merlin, and if we could pinpoint a historical Merlin, it seemed to fit better, and when I went there, it felt more there, if you know what I mean. If it still felt like it was part of the cultural conscious of that area in Scotland, whereas I didn't feel that in Wales. It felt like a tourist thing. And in Scotland, it was like there was no tourist thing. It was just in the culture. So Heartfell, it's like the ground zero for me. It's a holy mountain that's basically, I mean, as far as I'm concerned, all the evidence points towards Heartfell is like the place where Merlin was living. The place where he lost his mind, it was a battle, right? He was basically having PTSD. The battleground is pretty much almost not contested that it was, in this place called, what's now called Ardareth, the Battle of Arthuret. So that place is only like, 15 miles. So you could basically go to the battlefield. You can see the fort. It's like on a farm, but it does still exist as like a Mott and Bailey structure. So you can go to the fort, see where he lost his mind. You can imagine him wandering, for however many years north to Heartfell. There's this place on Heartfell called Heartfell Spa. It's like a Victorian enclosure of a natural spring. So it's kind of like just it's almost like an altar or something. I mean, it's sort of got this shape like what you'd imagine is like a stained glass window on an altar or something. And you can go in there. It's like this little brick cave. There's a spring there. It's like a little pool. It looks really disgusting, but there's one part of it that's drinkable. And you can dip your thing in there. It's chalybeate, so it's iron rich. So when you drink it, it has a really funny flavor. If all this research is true, you can go to the place, or almost the same place where Merlin drank the spring water and regained his sanity. And then you can go up to the top, and there's a 360 view. It's super beautiful. That was the heart of the Caledonian forest back then. Now the forest has been clear cut. You can go up there and camp and whatever. It's just a hill, so you can do whatever you want up there. That's all you need. There's other places you can go, but just spend a couple days up there and you're going to feel pretty good. I sang everywhere I went. I mean, that was part of my journey, was through vocal expression. I sang everywhere. And that was part of the way that I really felt like I was weaving it all together. I was doing energy work in all of the places, and I was singing in all the places with a really strong intention to actually connect them all together. Like if they're not already connected. I think I went to maybe 50 different sites throughout the UK. Because I did go down to Cornwall and into Wales and into Scotland. I mean, I did do all of it, but like the idea was like create a web. This was my part of my original idea: create a web through song and through energy work, and intentionally hook them all together. You know, like a web, like a spider web, and then see what happened. And when I was doing the historical side of it, you know, like because the year before I left, it was all research. You know, it took me 1 year to do the research and the planning. So I was really asking myself that question too: who is Merlin? And of course, anyone who's read any book will know that there's more than one historical Merlin, and there's also, you look through history, there's more than one interpretation of Merlin. Like there's a lot actually. You know, we can look at the Sword and the Stone Merlin, or the Excalibur Merlin, or the Welsh Legends Merlin, and they're not really the same interpretation of that motif. And so for me, I wanted to go to the source. You know, I didn't really care about what the French had done in the Renaissance, and I didn't really care too much about what, you know, Hollywood had done in the 1900s, even though those were what got me to there. But I was like, the only thing that matters to me is the Welsh poetry, you know, like Geoffrey of Monmouth and before. And Geoffrey of Monmouth, everything is with a grain of salt for me. Like, I use him as a guide, but I don't really believe half the stuff that he says, because when you compare him to the sources, half the stuff that he says is it doesn't make sense. Like it's been altered to make a better story. So I look for clues in Geoffrey, and he's a great source because he's old, 1200s, you know. That's pretty old. But then when you look at the Welsh stuff, it's older, like the Black Book of Carmarthen, or, you know, there's like 3 or 4 different books where these poems come from, all in Welsh, and all kind of 700s, 800s. So I was really only looking at primary sources, of course, English translations, because I don't read Welsh. So that's where I focus. So all the French stuff, the Holy Grail, you know, some of the other stories that have been added on there, I didn't really look at those too much, and I didn't really care too much, because obviously, like, the further you get into modern times, the more embellished and romantic it becomes. And that's fun, but like for that particular quest and trying to look at the roots and the land, I was like, okay, I just want to look at the primary stuff, the original Welsh stuff. For me, the ultimate aspect of Merlin, is the wild Merlin. You know, the mad Merlin who drinks from the spring and he regains his memory. The Merlin who, because of his madness, has also had some sort of peak experience through nature, you know, like an animal. You know, when he comes back from his madness, he was like living in an animal-like state, and he understood nature like animals do, intuitively, without sort of logic and reason, but with emotion and an intuition. And so he understood the seasons and he understood the stars, and he was able to kind of come back into normality and relate it. I don't think we need to go much further than that to find this magical thing. You know, we don't really have this sort of holy grail or necessarily directly magical powers, because that early Merlin, he was a prophet more than anything else. You know, his magic was seeing the future or just being in harmony with nature. And so when I took it down to that level, you know, to that sort of deepest root, which is what I think is probably the deepest root, I thought, you know, the great thing about this Merlin, this version of Merlin or whatever, it still really resonates, at least with me, but I think with a lot of people. You know, when we look at life in 2020, and I think the more that I've traveled now, this really is true. It doesn't matter what country you're in or where you're at in the world. We are completely like divorced from the natural world, right? We're living in a world of electronics and automobiles and skyscrapers and whatever else, you know, like we're living in a constructed society, and everybody understands that. You know, everybody loves camping and everybody loves hiking, you know, because it's an escape. And it's like something that kind of gives us a little bit of refreshment when we can't take the fast-paced modern world anymore. And so when I look at that Merlin and I look at what he says then and what it means to me now, it's completely relevant. It's like, slow down, take communion in the earth. He doesn't directly say it that way, but that's the way I interpret it. I mean, that was why I did the whole quest, right? I wanted to stop for a moment and just look at real life, nature life, animal life, plant life. When I went there, and when I took that moment and I stopped and I went to the places and I drank from the springs and I slept under the stars and did everything I needed to do, in the end, I did come away with like a pretty profound, I guess, like epiphany. I had a couple peak moments, and they were always on top of hills. One of them was in Glastonbury, one of them was in Scotland, on the hill in Scotland where all the action kind of takes place then or now or whatever. So Heartfell is like to me, the sacred mountain, or the holy mountain of Scotland, in the Merlin story. And so I stayed up there for a few days. I did a fast of only apples and drinking the spring water. I had such an epiphany up there. What I came down the mountain with, like the understanding was like, be a steward of the land, be a caretaker. The thing that shocked me was it had nothing to do with magic. It had nothing to do with healing, or it did have everything to do with healing, but not in the way that I expected. Like I was expecting Harry Potter, and I got something way more shamanic, something way more primal and obvious. It's like everybody knows we should take care of the land. Everybody knows that we should take care of the water. And the feeling that I came away with was almost like activism, like become an activist for the natural world because it's becoming destroyed and because it's sacred and it's important. And if we destroy the world, we can't do another sacred quest into nature because it's just like the city has spread into the country and taken over, which I don't think we'll get to that point. It would take too long. I didn't know what to do with that. What do you do with that kind of epiphany? It didn't really fit into my worldview in that moment, where I was kind of coming out of one space, which was trying to hold the space of like being a healer and a sort of a therapist for people, and then transitioning into this other space where I was more of an artist, with the gem cutting and all that stuff. So even now, 5 years later, I'm still kind of pondering that, like what was I supposed to do with that? Sometimes you don't quite understand, and maybe it's still unfolding for me. I don't really know. I would say yes, Merlin is real, and he's there for the finding, and I don't think you need to do the quest, but it isn't a bad idea. And I don't know if it's coincidence or has nothing to do with it, but I will say that everything that's happened to me since that year has just been like, looking at my life after 2015, I mean, there was already a bunch of other stuff happening, but like everything went up from there, like everything from my job to my income to my relationship status to my locality on Earth, like everything just went up. And I don't know if that had to do with the quest, but it's not a bad sign for sure. Along the way, my goal was to meet all of the authors that have ever written about Merlin that that are still around. And that part of the quest was very, very successful as well. I think the pinnacle moment as far as the literary side of it was like sitting around a dinner table with John and Caitlin Matthews and Nikolai Tolstoy in the Matthews residence, and just being like, how did this happen? Like how did this is impossible, but we were there, and we were all just, like and they had never met before. Like they knew about each other. They don't live that far away from each other. But I like somehow was like, okay, can we get you guy? I don't know. It was crazy. And that was, to me, that felt like I really touched in because, those guys are like, for me, like up here, they're the ones that helped put in the steps for me to do what I did. Without their books, I wouldn't have been able to find my way. And, and obviously before them, there was a generation of people before that were, the Merlin scholars in the 60s and the 50s and the 40s. And even going back into like the 1880s, there was scholars doing the same stuff. So like, I felt really like it was a moment of like somehow passing the torch, like what, not necessarily as a writer, because it was kind of like they were like, wow, we need new blood and you're doing the thing. But since I didn't put the book out yet, I still feel like somehow the energy is moving to a new generation, whether it's through me or just with me. with me and everybody else in our generation. But that felt good, and it felt like we're keeping it all moving, which is important. We don't want it to get stuck in the 1970s or whatever. We want it to come with everything else, even if it has to come into Facebook and Zoom and Instagram and whatever else. Who cares? Like, just bring it with us and not leave it behind. I think maybe the most important thing is just to have the dialogue, something like this, or we did this conference earlier this year that I felt like was also in that spirit of keeping the ideas flowing. Maybe one of the weirdest and most interesting parts of the Merlin story is like the sort of esoteric energy worker side of it, which is just something that's been since the 90s. There's like all these different sort of energy healing modalities that have come out of this idea of Merlin. You have like the Vortex Energy group, the Magical Awakening group, the Merlin Energy group in Wales. And so there's like at least 3 different modalities that I know of where you could tap into like a pre-existing community of people that are regularly talking about this in a really esoteric sort of energy worker way, which, I don't know, for some people is not that interesting, and for some people it's terribly exciting. When I look at that expression of the Merlin story or the Merlin experience, and then I look at like the Welsh poetry, it's almost like I'm not sure how connected they are metaphysically. Because, when you look at the oldest stories of Merlin, there's not really a framework for healing necessarily. Like, there is some moments where they do get healing, mental healing, from drinking from a sacred spring. There is, I guess, the foundation for the idea of healing in the Merlin stories, but there's never a moment where Merlin is using his own power, so to speak, to heal. It's always through the earth, usually through water. But I don't know, obviously I've had a lot of profound experiences with the Magical Awakening experience. One thing I really like about the Merlin story is that it's very obvious that Merlin was some sort of scientist. Like when you read that early Welsh stuff, and especially like in the way that it's expressed in Geoffrey of Monmouth, Vita Merlini, he when he actually does regain his sanity, he like pretty much starts like a mystery school. He has this glass house that's in the middle of the woods, and he brings, his sister joins, and this other poet joins, and this other guy who basically was also sort of battle scarred joins, and he's like, basically teaching the mysteries about the mysteries of the universe, the mysteries of the stars, the mysteries of the seasons and the planets and the elements and all this stuff. And it's very proto-scientific, like if it would have been 700 years later, he would have been like a Renaissance man. Well, like, and especially, if you're following the magical currents, go 700 years later and you've got John Dee in England, and he was like the magician of England who really was feeling a kinship with Merlin, and who, he really thought he was the Merlin of his time. And it's kind of seemed like he was, and he was really very much a scientist and an alchemist and an experimenter, and I like that Merlin, going back into an earlier and more sort of archaic time, he was also looking at nature with a scientist's eye, or like an inquisitory eye. And so I like that we won't get so locked into a sort of a new age idea that we should shun the world, or even the new world. I don't feel like the Merlin energy is the energy that says like, go live in a cave. That was like my fantasy before I left. I was thinking, I'll go live in a cave. Maybe that's how it's all going to end. I'm going to see the mysteries of the universe, and I'm going to see through it all, and I'm going to live in a cave. And even though I still have that fantasy, I don't know, maybe a lot of us have that escapist fantasy, but like that's actually almost in opposition to what I discovered. And I guess that's why it was surprising to me. It was kind of like, embrace whatever tools you have, whatever is there for you. And that might mean social media or video, whatever communication tools we have. Who cares? Like, it's not about that. It's about, doing something good. Whether you do become that spiritual eco-activist where you're crusading for the sanctity of nature. For me, I didn't take it that way. Actually, it didn't appeal to my other side, my more logical side, but I did see how it could overlap into the idea of being an artist and working with your hands and trying to, be whole, to be able to express something. So for me, that is really how I've run with that energy. I've continued to work with my hands and try to get deeper into a more primitive way of working, a more simple way, to try and be as pure as possible, but not fearing social media, not fearing the internet, not fearing technology, because the message that came to me when I was on top of that mountain wasn't like go live in a cave. It was like embrace your gifts, embrace yourself, embrace nature, and try to live in harmony with it. Merlin's spirit is reminding us that there is nature, and you should take breaks, and you should incorporate that into whatever part of your day it is, whether it means like, you've got your Palo Santo stick that you smell just to remember that everything doesn't smell like electricity, or you have a moment in your day where you light your sage or you light your incense and you take a breath and remember, okay, like I'm part of the universe.